What punishment, torture, real or imagined, seems light at first but is actually pure hell? When I was around 10, I was sometimes forced to stand in the corner of the room for hours staring at the wall. At the same time, my parents and siblings would be sitting in the room, kneeling on grains of rice. In Italy, it was once a common punishment to make children kneel on raw hard chickpeas. And in Hungary, on corn. Sea salt brings about the same horrific sensation, if not worse. My knees were bleeding within an hour. Holding hands up for a long time reminds me of school when I asked the teacher if I could go to the restroom. Or that time when you finally gathered the courage to ask a question, and the teacher just doesn't notice you and your raised hand. You are made to listen to the same song on repeat, and then some parts of the song are skipped. This is one of the forms of torture used by the CIA, and it's just awful. Can I ask what the consequences of such torture are? If the same song plays non-stop for several hours, you get used to it. You learn the lyrics, feel the rhythm and timing. You start noticing even the slightest things like individual drum beats. Gradually, you completely get used to the song. But if after 3 days the song, suddenly interrupted, starts playing from the beginning with some small changes, you immediately notice that something is wrong. Your brain begins to resist because it has become very accustomed to the melody. Simply put, you start having panic attacks and other reactions. It's like seeing an abnormally large bruise on your body that appeared out of nowhere. You would start panicking too. Waterboarding. If any of you guys don't know, in the early 2000s there was a big debate about this. Some people called it torture, while others said things like, "What's the big deal? It's just water being poured on someone's face, so what?" Indeed, put this way, it sounds trivial, not like torture at all. You just lie someone down, restrain them, and pour water on their face, right? I remember a conservative radio host had a brilliant idea. He wanted to prove live on air that it's not as bad as some people claim. He called in his staff and instructed them to perform this waterboarding technique on him live. And you know what? I respect this guy for doing that. He had a firm belief and was willing to go through such an ordeal to try to prove his point. However, he lasted only 15 seconds before he passed out, started wheezing, and coughing in 5-second bursts. Finally, he managed to say, "This is real torture." Then he asked for a break to recover. Kudos to him for admitting he was wrong. Holding a piece of ice with salt water in your hand for some time. This is called the salt and ice challenge. People hold the ice as long as they can, which often leads to frostbite resembling 2nd and 3rd degree burns. Moreover, the ice essentially sticks to the skin, so if you try to let go, it will tear your skin off. You need warm water to remove the ice from your hand. I did this challenge about 20 years ago, long before it became popular on social media. It's brutal. Edit. Given the popularity of my comment, I feel the need to warn you. Do not try this at home. Has anyone seen the Black Mirror episode called White Christmas? Imagine being locked in a room with nothing in it. Like, absolutely nothing. And all you have is endless boredom. I don't remember which country used this torture, maybe Russia or Japan, but it doesn't matter. It was called white torture. You were dressed in white clothes and locked in a cell with white walls and a white door without windows. You had a white light bulb with no shade. The bed and bedding were also white, and you were fed only white rice, served in a white bowl with white utensils. You drank water from a white cup. Within a day or two, you'd start having hallucinations due to the lack of visual stimulation. The bed and bedding were also white. Just poop on the bed. Like, smear your poop all over the place to keep from going insane. Well, that's one way out, but then you have to endure the smell of your own poop. Since the question also mentioned imagined tortures, I'll mention one from the TV show Star Trek: Deep Space Nine. It was copied a few times in Black Mirror, and sci-fi has probably used this concept even before DS9. Basically, it's the idea of time dilation. The idea is that in the real world, time flows differently than in another. So, as punishment, Miles O'Brien was strapped to a chair for an hour and sedated, and he dreamed he was serving a 10-year prison sentence. Or maybe longer, but the point is, in his mind, he was locked up for many years. In this dream, he was supposedly deprived of food and definitely had no social interaction. Eventually, he woke up, and only an hour had passed in the real world. There's a short horror manga called The Long Dream by Junji Ito. It revolves around a similar concept. A man ends up in a hospital because his dreams get longer each night. Gradually, his dreams become so long that he lives an entire lifetime in one night, and upon waking up, barely remembers what happened. Eventually, the dreams span thousands of years, and it becomes truly horrifying. Highly recommended. Edit. Also recommend Stephen King's short story, The Jaunt. The concept is the same. Some people lived entire years in a single moment, and it caused massive psychological trauma. Getting out of punishment for a crime by being declared insane. Instead of a temporary prison sentence, you get indefinite imprisonment in a poorly funded, horrific medical facility. You might stay there for the rest of your life. Yay! On Teo, there's an amazing article about a journalist interviewing a guy in a psychiatric clinic who pretended to be insane to avoid prison. The guy says he lied to the court, pretending to be insane. He thought he could fake being crazy for a while and then miraculously recover and get out. Nope. It turns out that convincing people you're sane is much harder than convincing them you're crazy. The guy started trying to prove his sanity, and the psychiatrists diagnosed him as a psychopath. Because, of course, only a psychopath would try to convince people they're sane. He began doing things to show he wasn't a psychopath, like expressing remorse for his actions, which only convinced the doctors that he was a manipulative psychopath simulating emotions. The guy spent 14 years in a psychiatric clinic, even though he could have gotten only 5 years in prison for his crime. Being an outlaw in old times. Today, we simply call any person who regularly breaks the law a criminal. In old times, being an outlaw was a real punishment. If you were declared an outlaw, it meant you were literally outside the law and couldn't expect any protection. If someone disliked you, they could beat, rob, torture, or even kill you with impunity. When Robin Hood is called an outlaw in the stories, it means exactly this. It's not about romance, heroism, and banditry, but about a state where a person had no legal protection. The king, or whoever he delegated, would take your land, and anyone who wanted could take your belongings. Plus, if someone didn't like you, they could beat you to death without facing any consequences. And there might even be a bounty on your head. People would then hunt you down to get the money. Imagine what would happen in our time if you lost the right to legal protection and anyone who brought your head to court could demand a year's salary as a reward. Solitary confinement. You might think isolating certain people could be beneficial to society, but in reality, it messes with the human mind so much that many come out worse than they were. I wouldn't wish it even on my worst enemy. It's strange to see that in many prison shows and documentaries, they use solitary confinement so easily. Like, oh, you caused trouble, created problems for us, spend a week in solitary. Yet in many countries, this punishment is banned due to its inhumanity. When we visited Africa, we learned that in some places they have their form of lethal injection for criminals, done through snakebite. A viper would literally bite rapists and murderers on both ankles. After law enforcement confirmed the bites, the culprits were sent home, under supervision, to spend their last day, or days, with their families. Some people think this sounds like a more humane form of execution, but it's not. Kneeling on salt. When I was 16, my mom told me that if I continued to behave the way I did, she would punish me by making me kneel on salt. Being a foolish girl, I said it was a lame punishment. It's just salt. Well, I kept acting out. So, my mom poured salt on the tiled kitchen floor, and I had to kneel in it for half an hour. The crystals cut into my knees, and the salt burned the wounds. I'm 32 now, and I still have scars on my knees. I'll preemptively say, yes, I know this was abusive behavior from my mother. She was pregnant and not in a good mental state at the time. My sister is now 16, and my mom has never even slapped her. Recently, my sister told me she thinks I must have been a bad disobedient child for mom to treat me that way. I told mom about this conversation, and she said, you weren't a bad child. I just had a bad temper and didn't know how to deal with it. I'm grown up now, with 2 kids of my own, and hearing those words made me cry as I walked home. I knew I wasn't a bad child, rarely caused trouble, never did drugs, etc. I just had a strong character, but I didn't realize how much weight I carried in my heart. I was the eldest of 3 kids, and I bore the brunt of it. I always blamed myself for everything. Even when I finally got over some issues and rebuilt my relationship with my mom, I kept blaming myself for things. I didn't even realize how badly I needed to hear those words from her. We had this conversation 3 weeks ago, and as I write this now, I'm crying again. Tickling. I'm not joking. Nazis occasionally used tickling as a form of torture. By tickling someone, you leave no marks. This torture was also used in places like psychiatric hospitals, where patients were restrained and where the staff sometimes found creative ways to torment them. In severe cases, tickling can lead to urination, vomiting, and loss of consciousness due to lack of air. Additionally, it's easier for the torturer to carry out this torture for a prolonged period. The conscience isn't troubled because the victim involuntarily laughs. In general, it's easy to pretend that this is not such a terrible torture. Goat licking. In medieval times, the offender would be tied by their legs between two wooden boards and their feet would be sprinkled with salt, or something salty. Then, an animal, usually a goat, would be brought in, and it would start licking the person's feet. Initially, it seems ticklish, but the animal doesn't stop and continues to lick. Eventually, the goat would lick off the flesh, gradually reaching the bones. Thank you for watching. Do you know any types of torture? Tell us about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel.